Previously, we talked about dynamic dots and how it's the basic default of Boxcutter. However, there's a secondary system of dots called static dots, which can be enabled by using the static toggle for dots in the static area, where we see that instead of fade options, we now have options pertaining to the static dot system. There's a couple of behavioral differences too whenever it comes to static dots. For example, when you're holding control, we see that there's no change with the dots as we hover over them except for a slight size change. We can also press tab and pause these dots, and you could also even press escape in order to unpause and just remove the dots. In fact, we can hold control and press spacebar, and that will also pause these dots on screen. And this can lead to some really interesting combinations. So for example, let's select this top face. We'll just press I to inset, and with this face we'll just give it a couple of subdivisions, and we see that another difference between static dots and dynamic dots is dots for static don't actually update when you roll your mouse over the surface. In fact, they remain underneath your cursor where it originated. So for this reason, static dots has its own special place inside of Boxcutter. However, it is a much more limited system, but that's not to say that we haven't expanded on it multifold in this particular update. So one of the things with snap dots now is, with us looking at this face, we can hold control and shift and actually roll the dots in order to subdivide them. So now we've subdivided this face and just added some additional dots. Previously I was showing how if I subdivided the face, we would only be able to see dots for a particular area. If we were to change this back to dynamic, you can see what would normally be expected with using dots on the surface. But with static, it's just static. So for the sake of demonstration, we'll just press Q. Under operations, we'll choose clean mesh, which will get rid of any extra dots. And so let's just hold control shift and roll these dots. And this is one of the new additions with this particular update, is the ability to subdivide dots, which will allow you to do things like this. Normally, whenever you perform a cut on the surface, the configuration of dots would change, which prevents you from being able to perform repetitive cuts in a sequential fashion. And this is something that I wanted to have resolved in one of the previous updates, but I'm glad we finally got around to it. So now you can see that no matter how many times I cut, the dots remain absolutely static, really leading up to its name. Right there I made a mistake, so I just pressed undo, and we see how undo is able to even persist and keep the dots up on screen, which is something that can't be said about most other systems. So let's continue working and just putting all these objects in the surface just to completely fill it up, and done. And just like that, you've now seen dot subdivision in action. So when it comes to the parameters, dot to dot snap allows you to snap from one dot to another dot. In fact, let's turn off increment snap to simplify this, and we see that when I drag from this dot, everything is free, but if I get to this dot, it will snap to it. So this is something that was around in the previous version. However, we're experimenting with ways to bring back this behavior in another fashion. So that's why you're seeing it at this state, at this time. So let's just right click, that is dot to dot snapping. The next one is alignment preview, which when it's enabled will basically make the dot show an alignment preview of what you're about to be drawing whenever you begin clicking and dragging. This can come in handy for times where we'll put an edge across. If we were to shift V and switch to nearest edge, we see that this dot's going to draw in a straight fashion like we've been used to. However, if we hover over this dot, we see that we're about to draw in a method that's actually oriented to this particular edge because we're using nearest edge at this time. So alignment preview can come in handy for cases where you want to see what you're about to be doing with snapping prior to it actually being used. The next one we'll be talking about is subdivision preview. So we talked about how you could hold control shift and perform a subdivision on the dots in order to subdivide them. However, this will actually show you a grid letting you know which dot is face, which one's edge, just in case you need a visual indicator for additional information. So this one isn't really needed for anything in particular, but it does serve as a nice diagnostic measure to just see what's going on with the surface. Of course, face subdivision doesn't happen when you're dealing with a non-quad or a non-flat face. If you're dealing with something that's an n-gon, you'll only be able to subdivide edges. So just know that that's a limitation of the system, and in those cases you would probably want to actually use grid. For example, we see that now whenever I attempt to subdivide, I'm no longer subdividing the faces, I'm only subdividing the edges, which is almost useless. But if we press escape to get out of that, we can talk about some of the other behaviors that are interesting with snap. One of the things I like doing with snap is pausing to keep a jump off point for later. So for example, we have this cylinder. We'll press Control and begin snapping. We'll press Tab in order to pause it. If I were to press D and jump to circle and we begin drawing a circle, and we press taper and bring this down and begin adjusting the auto smooth, we see that we're not able to get to this rim anymore. And we used to have a feature called Simple Trace that would allow us to do this. However, now I see that that potential is able to be handled by simple dots, at least at this time. And one of the benefits of having your dots paused like this is, let's say I wanted to draw a box, but I wanted to radial array it. Well, now I can radial array around the center because I have a previously paused state. Let's say that we applied this and we got rid of it and we wanted to begin snapping from the center again. Well, we see that we're actually unable to. So one of the things that I've been actually experimenting with personally to get used with is the possibility of just going under the modifier tab and just choosing toggle modifiers and then bringing up dots, pausing them, pressing Q, and then toggling the modifiers back on. And now we see that we now have a dot in the center that we're able to use to jump off of. So sometimes frozen dots can come in handy for giving you access to areas that are no longer accessible because they've been cut and the data's just been changed. So this is one of the big benefits that comes with snap dots, and really just the tip of the iceberg. So when it comes to dots and snapping, just enabling snap will allow you to begin using dots when you press Control and hover over the surface. With dynamic, there's also some behavioral differences. Notice that whenever I hold Control and begin dragging over this, that I'm able to freely bring this out using center draw, versus if we change over to the static system and we begin playing off of this, we see that we actually have to press Alt, which is similar to our classic system, in order to begin expanding out. So static dots has some differences in behavior compared to dynamic because of the ways that the systems differ. However, in case you're wondering why there's two different systems for dots, it's because stability can be variable across different systems. So for that reason, we've created two different systems for dealing with snapping in order to ensure that no matter what sort of system or issues that you might be experiencing related to OS or drivers or whatever, that you're still able to utilize snapping in your project and get to the end of your goal. So for the most part, dots is something that's just there for whenever you need it, but it isn't a mandatory system by any means. In fact, a big question internally is why don't we just replace dots with grid? However, I'm completely against that because I feel that dots have a very specific place in our tool, allowing users to be able to perform the operations that they need at the time that they need. Just a small operational thing being done at the time that doesn't need to become a long drawn out system, which is what you would get whenever you begin activating grid. Not to say that grid isn't accessible enough, but that dots is intended to just be a little bit more accessible whenever it comes to just creating shapes and starting out. So I've gotten quite used to the differences between static dots and dynamic. However, I must say that the behavior changes that we've made with dynamic definitely shine through and is one of my favorite things about it, especially the ability to use snapping and just jump off of midpoint without having to hold Alt. So just something to keep in mind whenever you're using both of these systems is there are some differences in behaviors. I did talk about how dots have the ability to have a view dot, allowing you to snap with view in the event that you need such a thing. And this is something that simply isn't present with static. Same thing with world dot. If we deselect it and we press Control, we see that nothing's happening in static, and that's because static is primed for stability, while our dynamic system is something that we aim to have be a little bit more experimental and definitely custom made for the Boxcutter experience. So now we see that we have our single dot back for drawing on the world, where we can begin drawing just on the grid floor just like that, and then selecting the object we can begin just drawing out of the face and doing what we would normally do with an object to begin detailing it using Boxcutter.